Hi, we're Ariel.
And Michelle,
And
and
we're
we're
the
the
board
Board
game
Game Tutors.
tutors.
And today we're going to go over our advanced concepts for the Shadow Elves Faction deck from the Summoner Wars Master Set. So we're starting with, right here, you can see on this card, this is the starting setup for the Shadow Elves deck. The summoner for this deck is named Selundar. And you can see on this card there are quite a few units on the board when you start out. So we're going to turn that card over. And on the opposite side, as with every faction deck, you can see the turn phase summary, which tells you all the steps you take on your turn. And then you can also see the names of all the event cards and how many you have of each. So we're going to be going over those event cards while we talk about this deck. And then we also have an example of a wall card from the Shadow Elves deck. All the wall cards are basically the same in every faction, but they'll just have a little bit slightly different coloration to distinguish them from the other walls. And you can see the hit points at the bottom, which is always the case. So there are 9 hit points on every wall. So here we have Selundar. He's the summoner for the Shadow Elves. He has 7 hit points, and his attack value is 2. And let's see here, you can see from the arrow, he has a ranged attack. So that means he can shoot units that he's not immediately next to, as with any unit that has a ranged attack. So let's look at his special ability. It's called Out of Shadows. When Selundar begins a turn without any enemy units adjacent to him, if Selundar attacks a unit that he is adjacent to during that same turn, add 2 to his attack value during that attack. So obviously this ability can be very powerful. What it means is that at the beginning of your turn, you want to check where Selundar is. Let's say he's right here. Now, if he's not adjacent to any other units, let's set that up. So these units are not touching him. They're not to the side. They're not above him. So they're not adjacent. So he fits those qualifications that he's not touching any other units at the beginning of his turn. And we can imagine these being enemy units. They're actually part of this deck. But yeah, if we check the text, it says any enemy units adjacent to him. So that's what you would be looking for. But in this case, there are no units adjacent to him. And so during his turn, he can move adjacent to another unit. And imagine if that was an enemy unit, he could go ahead and attack it with 2 extra dice. So that means he would roll 4 dice, which would give him a very good chance of destroying another unit or wounding it badly. So that's his special ability called Out of Shadows. You can imagine him like he was hiding in the shadows and popped up out of nowhere. So that made him stronger because he's a shadow elf. Next, we have the basic common units from this deck. So every faction has common units that there will be several of. There will be several of each of the common units in the deck. So first, let's look at the swordsman. Let me see if I can get that focused. So he's got an attack value of 2, meaning he rolls 2 dice. He has 1 hit point, so he can get hit only once before he dies. And it has a summon cost of 1. And he's a melee fighter, so he can only attack units adjacent to him. So the swordsman's special ability is called Swift. And this says, when moving this swordsman during your movement phase, you may move it up to 1 additional space. So basically he moves faster than other units. That makes it called Swift. And so he can move 3 spaces, 1, 2, 3, instead of the usual 2. So that's pretty helpful. He can get across the board a lot faster than other units. Then the next common we're going to talk about is a ranger. Shadow Arrows is the name of her special ability. Oh, and first, her attack value is 1, so she rolls 1 die when she attacks. She costs 1 to summon, and she has a ranged attack, and she has 1 hit point. All right, so let's look at her special ability. Shadow Arrows. Once per turn, when this ranger destroys a unit, you may place this ranger on the space the destroyed unit occupied. If you do so, you may then spend 1 magic point to attack with this ranger 1 additional time. So she can not only move during her movement phase, but she can actually move forward if she destroys another unit. And so this you would normally use against an enemy unit, but it can in fact be used against any unit if you decided to attack your own unit. So yeah, let's set up a scenario like that. So we've got the ranger shooting at this swordsman. Okay, she rolled a 3, so that's a hit. That means she destroyed that unit. So she has the option, if you want to, and it is optional, of moving into that spot. And then if we had the magic to spare, we could spend 1 magic point and actually have her attack again. So, of course, that's very powerful. You're getting in a whole extra attack on your turn. All right, so that was the ranger. And then the third common unit is called a scout. And these scouts are pretty helpful because they actually have a summon cost of 0, as you can see. Summon cost of 0, and so you don't have to pay anything to put them on the board. You can put as many as you want during your summoning phase. You have an attack value of 1, so you're going to roll 1 die, and you have 1 hit point. Now, the Scout's ability says, if this scout is on your opponent's side of the battlefield at the beginning of your turn, you may move with 1 additional unit during your movement phase on that turn. So, in our experience, it's a little tricky to have this happen because the scout does have to survive your opponent's turn. But if she's still alive on the other side of the board when your turn starts, then you're going to get to move an additional unit. So here would be an example of that. If she's over on the other side when your turn starts, then you get to move 4 units instead of 3 units during your movement phase. So that ranger could move, the scout could move, Selundar could move, and let's see, we have another unit out there. Yeah, that swordsman could also move. Okay. All right. So those were all the common units for the Shadow Elves. Now we have the champions. So first, Exacerbane. Now, as you can see, he's quite powerful because he rolls 3 dice. You can see that right there. He only costs 4 to summon, which is pretty amazing. And he's a melee fighter. And he has 4 hit points. So he can die quickly. But his special ability is called Sneak, and that's going to be very helpful to combine with his 3 dice that he rolls. So Sneak says, if you move only this card during your movement phase, you may move it up to 2 additional spaces. So in our experience, we would tend to summon Exacerbane when we are ready to have him go after the enemy summoner and hopefully kill or seriously wound the enemy summoner because, as you can see, he rolls 3 dice. And having those 2 additional spaces, if you can summon him and then move him 4 spaces across the board, you know, if you're in the right position, then you can actually move him all the way up to the summoner. And we've seen him win games before. So his special ability and his rolling 3 dice make him quite powerful. So that's Exacerbane. Then we have the Hydrake, another very powerful champion. His ability, or let me tell you first, his attack value is 3. He costs 8 to summon, so as you can see, he's quite valuable. He's a melee fighter, and he has 8 hit points. So what's really special with the Hydrake is Assault. When Hydrake attacks, it may attack all enemy units that are adjacent to it. Resolve each attack separately. So let's show an example of that. If the Hydrake is surrounded by enemy units, imagine these being enemy units, he doesn't have to choose which one he's going to attack because he's able to do a separate attack on each of them. So, you know, in this case, he could almost, you know, potentially take out all of these units. Like, let's show an example. If let's say he rolls first against the ranger. Okay, we got 1 hit there, so the ranger would be gone. All right, and then let's have him roll against the scout. Scout would also be gone with those 2 good hits. He only needed 1. And then 3 against Exacerbane, so Exacerbane could almost be taken out here. Yep, he got 3 hits, so there would be just 1 more hit left. And of course, if you had another unit on the other side, then you could attack also with that one. So you get in 3 attacks for kind of the price of 1 with the Hydrake. So he can definitely win. We've seen him win games before.
Actually 4 if he was completely surrounded.
That's right, yeah. He could actually do 4 attacks if he was completely surrounded. And that all counts as 1 attack because he's just 1 unit attacking.
And the main thing here is you have to resolve each attack separately like we just did. So you don't roll the dice once and apply it to everyone. You roll for each person.
Yep. Okay. And now we have Malidala. She is another champion of the Shadow Elves. She costs 5 magic to summon. She rolls 2 dice, and she has a ranged attack. Her special ability is called Shadow Dancer. The first time Malidala is attacked on a turn, choose one of the dice that were rolled for that attack. Ignore the result of the chosen die. Okay, so let's say she's being attacked by a scout. If he was an enemy unit.
Let's do one smart dice.
Okay. So Exacerbane. Yeah, that makes more sense. Okay. So Exacerbane rolls 3 against Malidala. Let's see, what did we get?
All successful.
All successful hits. There, yeah, the other die went over there. There it is. Okay. So, how does this work? So we would get to ignore one of those dice. So basically she would get 2 hits instead of 3. So that can sometimes, save her life, because she actually would have died if all 3 of those had been good. And again, this can come in really handy. We've seen this happen toward the end of a game where Maladala actually was able to stay alive because of her ability to ignore dice that were being rolled against her, and she helped Selundar win the game. So
And also,
another really good champion.
For example, if the scout rolled against her, that was a successful one, but once, the first time she is attacked,
right,
she can ignore it. So if it was just the scout attacking her and she had 2 hits on her, this wouldn't count because she could just ignore it.
Yep. So pretty awesome. And it's called Shadow Dancer, so you're probably supposed to imagine her like jumping into the shadows right as she got attacked, something like that. Okay, so those were all the champions and the commons and the summoner. Now we have the event cards. So here's one called Into Darkness. Choose an opponent. If you have fewer units on the battlefield than that opponent does, choose up to 2 of that opponent's common units that have a summon cost of 2 or less. Discard the chosen units. So when you're playing against the Shadow Elves, it can be very frustrating to have this card come up, because it allows the Shadow Elves to simply take out 2 of your units without having to do anything. They just discard them. And those would go into the Shadow Elf player's discard pile. So, yeah.
And the reason it says choose an opponent is because when you play a game of Summoner Wars, you can actually play with 4 players, a 2-on-2 match of 2 armies fighting against 2 other armies. But that's why it says choose an opponent, because you might have multiple opponents in a given game. But I'm assuming most of the time you'll probably just be playing against 1 person. The other thing to notice is when you play this card, you have to have fewer units on the board than your opponent. So you do have to mentally calculate, okay, I have 3 units on the board, they have 5 units on the board, I can use this card.
Right.
And you also have to pay attention to the fact there's the summon cost of the units that you discard. Well, 1, they have to be common units, but 2, their summon cost has to be 2 or less. So, for example, like we said, most champions are probably higher than 2, so that would automatically invalidate them. But this scout, for example, say this was on the enemy side, that's a summon cost of 0, so that one would be eligible. This ranger is a summon cost of 1, so that would also be eligible. And so would this swordsman with a summon cost of 1.
That's right.
So sometimes commons in other armies, they cost 4 magic or 3 magic. Those would not be available to be eliminated by Into Darkness.
Right. Okay, the next event card we're going to talk about is called Stalking Advance. You may move all Shadow Elf units that you control up to 1 space each. So essentially, this card is giving you some extra movement, because it happens, of course, during your event card phase, and that means it's before movement. So you're going to be able to move all of your Shadow Elf units 1 space, and you can move up to all of them, doesn't have to be all of them. And then you're going to still have your movement phase next. So essentially, they all can move up to 3 spaces during your turn in total.
And this card can be useful for getting Selundar. Let's say, for example, that he was 3 spaces away from the nearest enemy unit. This is how you would move him 1 space, and then you could use his regular movement phase to move him 2 more spaces to reach an enemy unit. Then he could use Out of Shadows.
Roll 2 extra dice.
So let's say, for example, you had these 3 cards on the board. You could move each of them 1 space during your event phase by using Stalking Advance, or you could just move 1 of them. It's your choice.
Okay. All right. Next card is called Summon the Night. Choose an opponent. During the chosen opponent's next movement phase, that opponent's units can only move up to 1 space each. During the chosen opponent's next attack phase, that opponent's units cannot attack cards they aren't adjacent to. So thematically, we can imagine that it's getting dark, and so it's harder for the enemy's units to move, and also harder for them to see, so that's why they have to only attack someone adjacent to them, because as if like they couldn't see far enough away to use a ranged attack. So again, this card is saying choose an opponent. So like Ariel was saying, if you were playing against 2 different opponents, then you would have to choose one of them. But in a lot of cases, you're just going to be playing against 1 opponent. And so, of course, you choose that opponent. And so during their movement phase, they would only be moving their units one space. So of course that's going to hamper them a lot and make it a lot harder for them to get closer to your units, and especially to get closer to your summoner. And then during their attack phase, they are going to be a lot more limited in who they can attack, because they can only attack units that they're adjacent to. And of course that matters more for a faction that has more ranged units. If they already have units that are only melee fighters, then of course they can only attack adjacent to begin with.
For example, the Mountain Vargoth, they're primarily melee fighters, so this wouldn't hurt them that much because they need to be next to you anyway.
Right.
Also, you can usually get some interesting combinations if you get both of these event cards in your hands. In your hand, then you can come up with an interesting combination. Like you might be able to use Stalking Advance to surround your enemies, like surround the enemy summoner, um, and then summon the knight. Yeah, like there's several interesting combinations that you can make using your imagination, obviously.
Right, because with Stalking Advance, you're getting to move extra, and then with Summon the Knight, your opponent is not getting to move much at all. So that could be a powerful combination.
Okay.
Then we have Shadows. So as you can see, this one has a fair amount of text. Instead of playing this card during your event phase, you may play this card when a common or champion Shadow Elf unit that you control is destroyed and placed in an opponent's magic pile. Remove the destroyed unit from your opponent's magic pile and place it face down on top of your magic pile. So essentially here you're basically robbing your opponent of magic, because this is saying that they've killed one of your units, they've taken it, put it on their magic pile, and then you pull out your Shadows card and you say, no, actually, I get that unit, and I get it from magic, right? Yeah, you get to take it from their magic pile and put it on your magic pile. So you didn't have a total loss there, because you actually get to use that unit for magic and they don't, which can be devastating for them if they were planning to use it to summon next turn.
And so the main important thing about this card is it's not played during your regular event phase. It actually happens during your opponent's event phase. So after your turn is completely done, and then it's your opponent's turn, then during their event phase, then you use Shadows. So
Actually, it would be when they've during their attack phase.
Yeah, during their attack phase.
Yeah, when they've killed one of your units.
When they kill one of your units, you reveal this card. So it's completely different timing. Like it comes out during your opponent's attack phase, step 5. So right. Basically,
you have to remember to have this ready when your opponent's attacking you. Right. And there are 3 of these shadow cards. They're the event card that you have the most of in the Shadow Elf deck.
All right.
All right. Was that all the event cards?
Yep.
That's all our event cards. So as you can see here, there are 3 shadows, 2 Summon the Night, 2 Stalking Advance, and 2 Into Darkness. And these cards, this card here, it will always tell you what event cards you have. So that's helpful for keeping track. All right, so those are all the details for the Shadow Elf faction from the Summoner Wars Master set.
Yeah, and I think the only other thing I would add would be the fact that given these common units that come with the base Shadow Elf set from the Master set, as you can see, all the commons only have 1 hit point each. So while some of your champions are very powerful and can be very strong in fighting an opponent's army, you do have to be very careful with these cards, because even the swordsman, who rolls 2 dice, which is a very useful card to have on your side, sometimes they die very, very quickly. So you have to be very careful not to give your opponent too many of these cards, because as you can tell, they'll die very fast. So as much as possible, you want to deny your opponent that magic, and also conserve your units as best as you can, because before you know it, you'll be out of commons and you'll be running away and trying to protect yourself feverishly.
And of course, those shadows event cards also help in stopping your opponent from using your units as magic. So you will get to use a few of your units as magic after they're destroyed by your opponent.
And one more thing that I wanted to add was, for example, one strategy that you could use when you're playing with this deck is, let's say you're the ranger here and you're all the way in the back of your side of the field, and you really want to bring that ranger up forward because, let's say, the opponent summoner is in a vulnerable position. One thing you can do, but I do not advise doing this very much, but in a critical moment, it's a good idea. Sometimes you can use your ranger to attack your own unit. For example, I would recommend the scout. I would not recommend attacking a swordsman because that usually is not such a wise choice. But this scout is a zero cost unit, so it's not that bad to kill that unit because it only costs 0.
So you didn't have to pay anything to get it on the board in the first place.
So, for example, you might roll one die. It's totally up to chance as to whether or not it'll be successful. Okay, I rolled a 4. So then that ranger successfully killed that scout. So that scout goes to your magic. And so you get that for magic, which is helpful. And then the ranger can go here to all of a sudden appear out of nowhere and attack the enemy summoner out of nowhere. You roll again. I roll a 4. So it's possible to get in one hit that way when the opponent wasn't expecting it.
All right, so that's all of our advice for the Shadow Elf faction deck. Let us know if you have any questions, and we will see you in our other faction videos.
All right, thanks so much.
Thanks so much for watching.
Bye.
Bye.